France in the early 1820s achieved a remarkable feat by re-establishing itself as a significant power within the international arena. However, this status was jeopardized in 1823 when France undertook a reckless invasion of Spain, a move that nearly precipitated a war among the great powers and threatened the stability of the international system. This raises a critical question. What led to a perceived decline in France's political acumen during the 1820s? To explore this, we must revisit the political landscape of France prior to the invasion, specifically in 1820, 3 years before the fateful decision to invade Spain. The 1820s marked a period of significant transformation in France, initiated by the assassination of the king's nephew by a leftist radical. This shocking event reverberated throughout the political sphere, prompting the aristocracy and their ultra-conservative allies in the legislature to call for immediate measures. In response to the crisis, the prominent politician Richelieu was reinstated as prime minister, where he implemented a series of reforms to the electoral system. Previously, one-fifth of the legislators were elected annually, and over the past 5 years, the ultra-conservatives had been steadily losing influence to centrist and leftist factions. The assassination intensified the ultra-conservatives' fears regarding the ascendance of the left, compelling Richelieu to take decisive action to curb their electoral progress. The newly established system mandated that 40% of legislative seats would be filled by a select group of affluent elites who were significantly more conservative and supportive of the monarchy than the general populace. This change was intentional, as those surrounding the king sought to shield themselves from the prevailing public sentiment, effectively creating a barrier between the ruling class and the electorate. They originated from the mindset of believing that ignoring problems would lead to their resolution. This rationale also contributed to the reduction in the frequency of elections. The essence of elections lies in their representativeness. The more representative they are, the more they contribute to the stability of the state. Such elections compel governments to tackle issues proactively, preventing them from escalating into existential crises. They also provide opposition groups with a constructive outlet for their dissent. Would one prefer to see discontented opposition groups distributing pamphlets or amassing arms? Which scenario do you believe is more beneficial for the long-term stability of the state? However, this dynamic is contingent upon the fairness of elections. In the absence of equitable electoral processes, groups may resort to unconventional methods, thereby increasing the likelihood of rebellion, civil unrest, or revolution. Consequently, the electoral reforms implemented in France in 1820 rendered the French state more vulnerable, as they were designed to shield the king and his favored ultra-conservatives from their escalating unpopularity. In my view, this was a misguided decision. Nevertheless, the ultra-conservatives did not perceive it as such. In the subsequent election under this newly manipulated electoral framework, they secured 85% of the seats in the French legislature, effectively overshadowing any opposing factions that challenged the king's authority. The ultra-conservatives believed they had executed a subtle coup and achieved victory. However, this was merely an illusion. Despite holding 85% of the legislative seats, the ultra-conservatives remained unpopular among the populace. The electoral reforms failed to address this underlying issue. They merely obscured it. Despite holding 85% of the seats in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives remained largely unpopular among the populace. The electoral reforms implemented did not address this underlying issue. Rather, they merely obscured it. In reality, the ultra-conservatives had initiated the groundwork for their own downfall. The substantial majority they held in the legislature led to the replacement of the centrist Prime Minister Richelieu with the extreme conservative Villèle. Subsequently, a few years later, as Spanish liberals sought to overthrow their autocratic monarch, Villèle convinced the King of France to launch an invasion. Villèle's sense of threat is understandable. He aimed to restore autocratic governance in France and was apprehensive about the potential for French liberals to replicate the actions of their Spanish counterparts. Although invading Spain was an unwise decision, Villèle was not operating with a strategic mindset. His focus was solely on his limited political ambitions. The proximity of liberal Spain did not pose an existential threat to France, nor did it warrant military intervention. However, it was politically disadvantageous for the ultra-conservative faction in France. One might expect that such a significant decision, driven by political motives, would ignite a vigorous debate within the French legislature. Surprisingly, it did not. With 85% of the legislature comprised of ultra-conservatives and a newly manipulated voting system in place, there was little concern regarding the upcoming elections. The members of the government complied with Villèle and the king without question. The potential escalation into a world war or a major power conflict did not seem to trouble any of them. The significance of their whimsical, ultra-conservative ideology far outweighed any other considerations for them. It is important to emphasize that the French populace did not support this stance. The ultra-conservatives had never enjoyed widespread popularity. Their dominance in the legislature was a result of elections that had been manipulated to favor their interests. In reality, the public leaned towards the liberals and Republicans. The centrist liberals opposed the invasion for clear reasons. The Spanish liberals were seen as ideological allies, and the left-wing Republicans shared their disdain for the invasion as well. The Spanish Constitution was a creation of their esteemed Emperor Napoleon, and for the millions of French citizens who had once served under him, the idea of invading another nation to reverse Napoleon's legacy was inconceivable. Nevertheless, this opposition was disregarded, and the invasion of Spain proceeded. In the subsequent French election, an overwhelming 96% of the seats were awarded to the ultra-conservatives. Consequently, there was virtually no domestic political resistance to the actions of Villèle and the King of France. However, it is crucial to note that significant opposition existed on the streets. The political system had been structured to exclude these voices from participation in governance. Shortly thereafter, King Louis XVIII, who had been reinstated to the throne following Napoleon's downfall, passed away. He was succeeded by his younger brother Charles X, a more autocratic and conservative figure. Under King Charles and his ultra-conservative Prime Minister Villèle, liberals and Republicans within the government faced a systematic purge. The term purge carries a weighty connotation. They were dismissed from their positions, but they were not executed. Villèle subsequently initiated a systematic reversal of the reforms established during the French Revolution, aiming to restore France to an 18th century political framework. The former king had vowed never to undertake such actions, a commitment that had maintained peace in France for the preceding 9 years. The new king, however, felt no obligation to uphold that promise. It is important to note that these actions were widely unpopular, and the populace was unreserved in expressing their discontent. Public dissent escalated to a critical level, prompting Villèle to impose stringent censorship laws on the liberal press in an attempt to shield the government from further backlash. Once again, there was a belief that ignoring the issues might lead to their resolution. It soon became evident that the new king held a rather antiquated perspective regarding his prime minister. At the start of each year, the king would provide Villèle with a list of priorities, and it was Villèle's responsibility to enact those items into law throughout the year. This arrangement suggested that the king was effectively acting as his own prime minister, relegating Villèle to the role of a mere assistant. Under such a system, the rationale for elections becomes questionable. The purpose of elections is undermined if the king is determined to exert personal control over the legislature regardless of the circumstances. It is perplexing why Villèle accepted such humiliation, but it may be seen as a natural outcome of his extreme ultra-conservative beliefs. One of the directives from the king to Villèle was to provide compensation to the aristocracy for the loss of their lands during the Revolution. Since the land had long been lost, Villèle's task involved redistributing wealth from the poor to the wealthy through taxation. This approach was predictably unpopular among the populace. The new taxes proved inadequate, forcing France to incur substantial debt to finance this initiative. The purpose behind these actions remains questionable, as they merely sought to restore the dominance of the French aristocracy. The nation was rife with political instability, and the impoverished populace continued to struggle for basic sustenance. The king's political judgment appeared severely misguided. A genuine election could have redirected the king's focus towards pressing matters, yet he showed little interest in such democratic processes. Over the years, the king and Villèle persisted in their unpopular ultra-conservative agenda, which a genuine election could have redirected the king's focus towards pressing matters, yet he showed little interest in such democratic processes. Over the years, the king and Villèle persisted in their unpopular, ultra-conservative agenda, which, although unintended, clearly contributed to France's profound political instability. In 1827, during a routine inspection of the Paris National Guard, the guardsmen unexpectedly erupted with shouts of, "Down with Villèle!" When officers attempted to restore order, one guardsman made a historic statement by striking his superior officer in front of the king. Before long, the officers completely lost command over the troops, unable to prevent another guardsman from breaking ranks and vocally denouncing the king. This incident served as a significant wake-up call for the ultra-conservative faction. The following day, Villèle's administration took the drastic step of disbanding the Paris National Guard. The backlash was evident, with even lower-ranking military personnel openly opposing the king. Villèle recognized that this could mark the onset of a period of unpopularity for the government, and thus advised the king to call for an early election to secure their legislative majority for the next 7 years. If Villèle were to secure a legislative majority at this juncture, he anticipated that all of his autocratic reforms could be implemented within the next 7 years. Following that period, he hoped he would no longer need to concern himself with elections. This prospect was perceived as an existential threat by the liberal and Republican opposition factions. They were apprehensive that, in 7 years, their political existence could be extinguished, potentially marking the final French election. Although the electoral system remained biased against the opposition, the liberals and Republicans mobilized all available resources to sway public opinion and present a formidable front. The results of the 1827 French election were as follows. 46% of the seats were allocated to a coalition of liberal and Republican opposition groups, 45% to Villèle's ultra-conservative government coalition, and 7% to a conservative faction opposing Villèle's administration. Despite the manipulated electoral framework, the liberal opposition unexpectedly emerged with the highest number of seats, leading to their elation. The king and Villèle had committed a significant error in judgment. Compounding the situation, it soon became evident that animosity existed among these groups, preventing any of them from forming a governing majority. Consequently, the king found himself faced with a stalemated legislature for the ensuing 7 years. In response, he dismissed Villèle and appointed a new ultra-conservative prime minister who was optimistic about reaching compromises with the liberals. The liberals and other opposition factions were buoyed by their electoral success and were eager for retribution, making collaboration with any ultra-conservative prime minister unfeasible. If the king genuinely wished to engage with the liberals, he ought to have appointed a liberal prime minister. However, he chose not to do so. In the subsequent year and a half, the legislature achieved little to nothing. Frustrated by this stagnation, the king dismissed his ineffective compromise prime minister and appointed someone who aligned more closely with his political ideology. In 1829, he selected an extreme right-wing ultra-conservative, Polignac, as prime minister. If a compromise ultra-conservative struggled to enact legislation, it was unlikely that an extreme ultra-conservative would fare any better. Nevertheless, the king was indifferent. He simply desired a prime minister who would advocate for his views and exert authority. To illustrate the extremity of this new prime minister, it is noteworthy that during the Napoleonic Wars, he was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the emperor, resulting in a 9-year imprisonment. Following the king's restoration, Polignac's political associate proposed the execution of Napoleon's supporters. The liberal opposition, particularly their Republican allies, were understandably alarmed by the prospect of such individuals gaining influence in government. Moreover, the king was unmistakably conveying a message of discontent. He indicated that the election results held little significance, as he was entirely willing to govern through his unelected and unrepresentative prime minister. This may serve as a forewarning of the potential future landscape of France. At this juncture, King Charles resolved to launch an invasion of Algeria. While he had some justification for this action, the specifics of the justification are of little consequence. The underlying motive was rooted in France's significant loss of colonies following its defeat at the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. The king believed that establishing a new colony in Algeria would help restore France's national prestige. One might question whether this is a valid rationale for colonization. What would the esteemed George Canning have to say on this matter? Canning contended that colonies were beneficial primarily to the extent that they enhanced trade. I do not recall him suggesting that the restoration of royal dignity following past defeats was a legitimate reason for colonial expansion. This line of reasoning will be frequently echoed by uninspired leaders throughout the 19th century. These individuals often became fixated on the visual representation of colonies on maps, subsequently using these representations to justify their policies. However, the significance of colonies should not be determined by their appearance on a map. A map is merely an abstraction, a conceptual instrument. The reality lies in the actual conditions present on the ground. What tangible benefits would the invasion of Algeria bring to improve the material circumstances in France? The answer is none. In fact, the consequences were detrimental. France would be required to deploy 20% of its military forces abroad, marking its second unnecessary invasion within a mere 7 years. This action severely compromised France's military preparedness for no justifiable reason. In the event of a crisis in Europe, France would struggle to mount an effective response. The plan was fraught with risk. Moreover, France was not in a strong financial position, and this invasion would impose a substantial economic burden. It is important to remember that France was still imposing taxes on the impoverished populace to subsidize the wealthy. Any additional taxation to fund this reckless military endeavor would likely provoke significant backlash. Nevertheless, King Charles and Prime Minister Polignac were determined to proceed, and they did so. In 1830, the king initiated that year's stagnant legislative session by proposing a relatively modest array of programs. However, many politicians found the manner in which he commenced the session to be quite concerning. He appeared to subtly imply the possibility of violence should anyone obstruct his legislative agenda. He even suggested that he might proceed without the legislature's consent if deemed necessary, positioning himself as the genuine representative of the populace, rather than the elected body. This was a significant revelation regarding the king's true intentions. Even members of the king's staunchly conservative faction expressed their discomfort. A few weeks later, the liberal opposition within the legislature managed to garner sufficient support to counter the king's actions. They dispatched a letter to the king, asserting that henceforth the king's ministers, including the prime minister, must secure the legislature's backing. The king could no longer appoint individuals at his discretion. Elections were meant to hold significance. King Charles was furious at what he interpreted as a blatant challenge to his authority. He accused the liberals of attempting to destabilize the government. Consequently, he resolved that collaboration with them was impossible, leading him to dissolve the legislature and call for new elections. According to his own electoral reforms, this move was 4 years premature. However, given the prevailing political atmosphere, the liberal opposition was likely to strengthen rather than weaken in the near future. Thus, he believed it essential to have a supportive legislature to navigate the impending challenges. Elections were slated to commence in late June, a timing that was deliberate. The French army was expected to land in Algeria in early June, leading to the anticipation that by the end of the month, positive developments might emerge to enhance support for the ultraconservatives. One politician implored Prime Minister Polignac to maintain the legislature's session until the elections, convinced that he could assemble a modest working majority of moderates from various factions. Polignac's response was, "It is quite surprising for a politician to express such a thought openly." The situation clearly illustrates that both Polignac and the king exhibited little genuine interest in the principles of liberal democracy. At this juncture, the ultra-conservative faction appeared to be adrift, primarily focused on consolidating power within the monarchy and the aristocracy, with scant regard for the broader populace or other institutions. Polignac himself did not seem particularly concerned with garnering popular support. Rather, his objective was to render elections inconsequential. Now let us examine Article 14 of the Constitution of France, commonly referred to as the Charter. The significance of this article cannot be overstated, so I will present its full text for clarity. The king serves as the supreme head of state, commands both land and naval forces, declares war, negotiates treaties of peace, alliances and commerce, appoints individuals to all public administration positions, and establishes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the enforcement of laws and the safeguarding of the state. To analyze this further, the king is identified as the head of state, possessing command over the military, directing foreign policy, and appointing all ministers. This is quite clear. However, there is an intriguing clause at the conclusion and makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state. This phrase essentially equates to the creation of laws, does it not? It implies that the king has the authority to enact any laws deemed necessary for state security. This raises a critical question. Who determines what constitutes a security matter? The king himself. This provision represents a significant loophole within the French Constitution, potentially allowing the king to wield extensive power under the guise of security. Supporters of the king within the ultra-conservative faction began to assert that the disruptive liberal opposition posed a security threat, suggesting that if the forthcoming election favored the liberals, the king could invoke Article 14 to nullify the results. No one had ever undertaken such an action before. Even among the ultra-conservatives, there was division regarding its legality. However, consensus among the ultra-conservatives was unnecessary. The sole agreement required was that of the king. After careful deliberation, the king addressed his most trusted ministers. He indicated that should the results of the forthcoming election be unsatisfactory to him, he would, in his own words, ensure that his prerogative was upheld. While the king was not overtly explicit, his intentions were clear to all. Regardless of the outcome, the liberal opposition would be ousted from power following the next election. The French military made landfall in Algeria in early June, and within 10 days they achieved their first significant victory, all proceeding as planned. On the day the news of the French triumph reached Paris, the king opted to create a grand public display by attending Mass, ostensibly to enhance his religious credibility just before the election. As anticipated, large crowds assembled to glimpse the king as he traversed the streets. However, there was no applause, no enthusiastic waving. The spectators stood in an unsettling silence, observing the king with the intensity of a pack of ravenous wolves. Voting commenced shortly thereafter and concluded in the third week of July. The prevailing sentiment leading into the election suggested a potentially close contest. In reality, it was anything but close. The Liberal and Republican opposition secured 65% of the legislative seats, while the king's ultra-conservatives garnered only 32%. The remaining seats were allocated to smaller factions opposing Polignac's administration, marking a significant triumph for the Liberals. In response to the election results, the king and his ultra-conservative allies convened to determine their course of action. The discussions revolved around Article 14 of the Charter. They contemplated whether to label the liberals in the legislature as a semi-treasonous faction, thereby granting the king the authority under Article 14 to enact necessary laws for the state's security. After extensive debate, the king resolved to invoke Article 14, leading to the establishment of what would later be referred to as the Four Ordinances. 1. Dissolve the newly elected liberal majority in the legislature. 2nd. Reform the French electoral system to render it nearly impossible for the liberals to secure victory in the future. 3rd. Promptly conduct new elections under this revised electoral framework, allowing the ultra-conservatives to dominate nearly all available seats. 4th. Suspend press freedoms and close down the liberal newspapers, which the king blamed for his declining popularity and the unforeseen election outcomes. Indeed, the newspapers were held responsible rather than the decade of unpopular policies. The king's cousin, Louis-Philippe, was unaware of the king's decision to take these actions. He discovered the Four Ordinances through a newspaper article. More sympathetic to the liberals than his cousin, Louis-Philippe expressed to his wife, "They have executed a coup d'etat." Later that day, he welcomed a large gathering of predominantly liberal supporters at his residence, where the king's Four Ordinances dominated the conversation. In a moment of uncharacteristic outburst, Louis-Philippe exclaimed, "They are insane. They will find themselves exiled once more." His liberal allies encouraged him to travel to Paris and lend his support to the liberal opposition. "I tossed him the bridle rein and directed my horse toward the path where I had observed the men heading. The scene was chaotic, and I dismounted twice only to remount again within a matter of moments, though the reason for my actions eludes me. Perhaps it was simply because I witnessed others doing the same, and assumed they were following orders. After traveling a short distance, I glanced to my left and behind me, spotting a significant number of mounted Indians racing through the woods in the same general direction as us, seemingly determined to intercept the men who had gone ahead. Initially, I mistook them for our Indian scouts, but a second look quickly corrected that assumption. These Indians were primarily clad in their battle gear, wearing only a breech clout and a feather, with a whip hanging from their wrist and a musket in hand. One striking exception was a robust individual, the closest among them, who sported an impressive war bonnet embellished with long feathers that encircled his head and cascaded down his back, the ends fluttering alongside his pony. I felt an urge to take aim at him, but the thick tree cover and my own lackluster marksmanship prevented me from doing so. Furthermore, my companion appeared resolute in his desire for a swift exit, prompting me to spare his life. Since that time, I have frequently contemplated whether that individual could have been one of the distinguished Big Chiefs, Gaul, or Black Moon. As I proceeded, I encountered exceptionally dense underbrush, and while forcing my way through, my right stirrup became ensnared, with the strap connecting it to the saddle nearly severed, rendering it inoperative. Consequently, I had to exercise considerable caution to maintain my equilibrium. In a time far shorter than it takes to narrate, I emerged from the thicket, ascended a small rise, and found myself on the prairie, not far from our initial entry point into the woods. The sight that met my eyes was profoundly disheartening. A mere 200 yards away, a vast and rapidly growing assembly of Indian warriors was advancing towards us at full speed, their ponies galloping fiercely. This cacophonous and tumultuous group of skilled horsemen and fierce combatants, the most formidable in our territory and beyond, had outflanked our left flank and cut off our route back to the ford where we had initially crossed the river. The nearest among them, firing from the opposite side of their ponies, unleashed a terrifying and intense barrage. To my left, a line of comrades was hastening eastward towards the bluffs, situated half to 3/4 of a mile away, at the base of which flowed the river, its banks steep and sheer, bordered by a dense thicket. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming, its suddenness and scale leaving me in a state of shock. Just moments before, we had been driving the Indians back with relative ease. We found ourselves in a defensive position with no opportunity for reflection. Each soldier in front of me extended his right arm, discharging his revolver at a parallel line of shouting Native Americans, and I quickly followed their lead. The once vivid image of the thin red line of English soldiers had faded into mere memory. In its place, a thickening line of Sioux warriors was forming, growing denser by the moment. From the swirling dust, hundreds more emerged, eager to engage, shouting and charging towards us soldiers, many of whom were facing their first battle and, like myself, had never fired a weapon from horseback. As previously mentioned, my right stirrup was rendered ineffective, compromising both my balance and aim. Nevertheless, I aimed to fire at an Indian directly across from me, who appeared particularly focused on my position. In the chaos, a multitude of thoughts surged through my mind. The chances of being injured or captured were significant, and the potential consequences of such an outcome were all too vivid in my imagination. Consequently, I decided to reserve one of the 6 bullets in my revolver as a last resort, intending to use it on myself if the situation demanded. However, destiny had other intentions. Our retreat led us through a prairie dog village, where the numerous holes and mounds created hazardous conditions for riding at our breakneck speed. 1. The persistent fear of my horse stumbling and casting me to the ground heightened my anxiety. After enduring several moments of this distressing ride, I arrived at the ancient riverbed, which lay approximately 3 or 4 feet below the surrounding land, featuring a steep bank that my horse navigated with a slight leap. As I regained my balance, my right hand, still gripping my revolver, instinctively reached for the pommel of my saddle. In that moment, my revolver slipped from my hand and fell to the ground. However, Louis-Philippe declined, stating that he would not openly oppose the king. For the moment, he chose to remain inactive. In Paris, the liberal newspapers were not passively accepting the situation. One publication notably declared, "The legal regime has now been interrupted. The era of force has commenced." They asserted that obedience was no longer a duty and continued by stating that France must determine the extent of its resistance. They were on the verge of openly advocating for revolution. That evening, soldiers attempted to shut down one of the many liberal newspapers defying the king's new censorship regulations. This action incited a crowd, which began to jeer at the soldiers, chanting, "Down with the Bourbons! Long live the Charter!" The soldiers attempted to control the crowd, but the situation rapidly escalated into a riot, with groups of people roaming the streets and vandalizing street lamps. By sheer coincidence, one of these groups encountered Prime Minister Polignac and his Minister of the Navy as they exited a cabinet meeting. The mob surrounded them and began hurling rocks. The politicians narrowly evaded the mob by leaping into a nearby carriage, although the Minister of the Navy sustained serious injuries. In an ironic twist, the French Navy found itself defeated on the streets of Paris, illustrating that no place was safe. On July 27, thousands of soldiers were deployed to suppress liberal opposition newspapers, which incited widespread protests throughout Paris. Initially, the soldiers attempted to escalate tensions by charging at one of the crowds on horseback, but this tactic failed. Subsequently, they resorted to firing indiscriminately into the crowd, resulting in 21 fatalities and numerous injuries. As the day drew to a close amidst the violence, new revolutionary slogans began to resonate within the protests. "Down with the aristocrats," "Death to the ministers." Just 24 hours prior, these had been liberal demonstrators advocating for constitutionalism and a free press. Now they had transformed into revolutionary factions intent on toppling the government. The violence had only served to further radicalize the populace. The following day, the crowds had swelled significantly. Major General Marmont, tasked with defending Paris, faced a formidable challenge. His garrison had been depleted for the Algerian campaign, and most of the remaining senior officers had been sent home to participate in the upcoming ultraconservative elections. Marmont's forces were ill-prepared for the turmoil they were about to confront. At noon, he entered Paris with the objective of securing key bridges and public squares, where protests had been most intense. What awaited them upon their arrival in the city was entirely unforeseen. In the past 24 hours, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars have taken up their old muskets to support the protesters. Each veteran has aligned with large groups of demonstrators, imparting valuable tactics within a single day. As Marmont's troops moved through the streets, they encountered an overwhelming number of barricades, thousands in fact. These formidable structures were constructed from broken cobblestones, discarded furniture, wagons, remnants of buildings, and any materials the protesters could procure. Some barricades reached heights of up to 3 meters, which for American audiences is a significant elevation. The seasoned veterans not only guided the protesters in erecting the barricades, but also advised them to seize the buildings flanking the streets leading to these barriers. This strategy aimed to enable the protesters to unleash musket fire on enemy soldiers from 3 different angles. Additionally, they fortified the buildings with cobblestones, roof tiles, and other projectiles that unarmed protesters could use against the advancing soldiers. To be clear, among these projectiles were also human excrement. As the soldiers advanced into the city, they encountered barricades that had not existed the previous night. When they attempted to retreat, they found themselves confronted by newly erected barricades that had appeared just hours earlier. It was akin to navigating a constantly shifting maze, compounded by the unpleasant addition of human waste. Marmont had failed to equip his soldiers with necessary supplies, resulting in the entire garrison spending over 8 hours in squalor, aimlessly marching in circles without food or water. Morale plummeted to unprecedented lows. A significant number of soldiers either surrendered to the protesters or defected to their side. As the sun began to set, many soldiers were compelled to launch direct assaults on the barricades merely to escape the city and return to their camp. Later in the day, the liberal opposition initiated negotiations with Marmont. They informed him that the king must annul the 4 ordinances as a prerequisite for any discussions. Marmont conveyed his understanding and agreed to present their request directly to Prime Minister Polignac. The Prime Minister categorically dismissed this initial demand and informed Marmont that no further meetings with the delegates would take place. Marmont was taken aback by this response and opted for the unconventional approach of writing directly to the king. He expressed that this situation was highly inappropriate, as a local military officer was circumventing the prime minister to advise the king on political issues. However, Marmont was in a state of desperation, and it appeared that those in higher authority were not treating the matter with the seriousness it warranted. The king replied, essentially instructing Marmont to remain steadfast. Unfortunately, Marmont's entreaties went unheeded. The following morning, Marmont retreated to a defensive position, determined not to be lured into another costly confrontation like the previous day. Almost immediately, 15 to 20% of Marmont's 12,000 troops defected to join the protesters. To reinforce his defensive stance, Marmont commanded his men to consolidate into a tighter formation, which the soldiers mistakenly interpreted as a retreat, leading to a further wave of defections. By noon, the situation had spiraled out of control, prompting the king to dismiss Marmont and order the garrison to withdraw from the city, transforming a feigned retreat into a genuine one. The protesters had successfully taken Paris. This entire sequence of events unfolded within just 3 days. Talleyrand, an elder statesman who had lost faith in the king and had been subtly supporting the liberal opposition, was among the first to grasp the full implications of the situation. As he and his political associates observed the soldiers departing the city, he pulled out his pocket watch and remarked, 29th of July, 5 minutes past, amidst the cobblestones, roof tiles, and other projectiles that unarmed protesters could hurl at the soldiers. Let us not be overly clever. Human waste is what I refer to, among other things. As the groups of soldiers moved deeper into the city, they encountered barricades that had not existed the previous night. Upon turning around, they found themselves facing new barricades that had appeared just hours before. It felt as though they were ensnared in a labyrinth, with the walls constantly shifting, compounded by the presence of human waste being carelessly discarded. Marmont had failed to equip his soldiers with necessary supplies, resulting in the entire garrison spending over 8 hours in squalor, desperately marching in circles without access to food or water. Morale had plummeted to an unprecedented low. A significant number of soldiers either capitulated to the protesters or defected to support their cause. As dusk approached, many soldiers were compelled to launch direct assaults on the barricades merely to escape the city and return to their camp. Later in the day, the liberal opposition initiated negotiations with Marmont, stipulating that the king must annul the 4 ordinances as a prerequisite for any discussions. Marmont conveyed his understanding and agreed to present their demand to Prime Minister Polignac. The Prime Minister categorically dismissed this initial request, informing Marmont that no further meetings with the delegates would take place. Marmont was taken aback by this response and opted to take the unusual step of writing directly to the king. He articulated that this situation was highly inappropriate, as a local military officer was circumventing the Prime Minister to advise the king on political issues. However, Marmont was in a state of desperation, and it appeared that no one in higher command was treating the situation with the seriousness it warranted. The king replied, essentially instructing Marmont to maintain his position. Unfortunately, Marmont's entreaties went unheeded. The following morning, Marmont withdrew to a defensive stance, determined not to be lured into another costly confrontation like the previous day. Almost immediately, 15 to 20% of Marmont's 12,000 soldiers defected to join the protesters. To address the vulnerabilities in his defensive strategy, Marmont instructed his troops to retreat into a more compact formation. This maneuver was misinterpreted by the soldiers as a withdrawal, which subsequently initiated a wave of additional defections. By midday, the situation had spiraled out of control, prompting the king to dismiss Marmont and command the garrison to evacuate the city, transforming a strategic retreat into an actual one. Consequently, the protesters seized control of Paris. This rapid sequence of events unfolded over just 3 days. Talleyrand, an elder statesman who had lost confidence in the king and had been discreetly supporting the liberal opposition, was among the first to grasp the full implications of the situation. As he and his political associates observed the soldiers departing the city, he pulled out his pocket watch and proclaimed, 29th of July, 5 minutes past midday, the elder branch of the House of Bourbon has ceased to reign. The liberal opposition was astonished by their unexpected triumph. Their initial aim had been to challenge the 4 ordinances and secure some political concessions from the king. However, they had inadvertently succeeded in toppling the monarchy. That evening, the king made an attempt to negotiate. Had he acted on Marmont's advice the previous day, it might have made a difference. But now it was too late. The liberals had taken control of Paris and were in a position to dictate the future course of events. The following day, the liberals and their Republican allies found themselves engaged in a fervent internal discussion. Some members advocated for leveraging their newfound power to dismantle the entire political system, while others cautioned against such drastic measures. The major powers were closely observing the developments in France, and any indication of a situation akin to the French Revolution could provoke them to intervene militarily. Such a scenario could potentially lead to a global conflict. To emphasize the gravity of the situation, as the liberal opposition convened to deliberate their next steps, they could hear shouts of "Long live Napoleon" echoing from the streets. The populace was in a volatile state. The individuals appeared entirely ready to reenact the French Revolution. However, it should be noted that the crowd's choice of slogans was somewhat misguided. Napoleon had passed away. He was no longer a living concern. Eventually, the liberals clarified their demands. They called for the removal of King Charles from power and advocated for a transition to a limited constitutional monarchy, inspired by the model of Great Britain. They believed this approach would be sufficiently radical to appease the Republicans and avert a civil war, while not so extreme as to alarm the other major powers and provoke a global conflict. The challenge lay in determining a suitable replacement for the king. Some of the more radical Republicans proposed Napoleon's 19-year-old son, but this suggestion was quickly dismissed. It was essential to avoid alarming the other great powers. Others put forth the idea of the king's 9-year-old grandson, Henry, but mainstream liberals rejected this option due to concerns that the tyrannical King Charles might continue to exert influence from behind the scenes. Ultimately, they reached a consensus on the king's 56-year-old cousin, Louis-Philippe. The liberal politicians who constituted the largest segment of the opposition coalition strongly supported Louis-Philippe, as it was well known that he harbored liberal sympathies. The more conservative factions within the group felt they could reluctantly endorse Louis-Philippe, reassured by the prospect of the monarchy's survival. Even the radical Republicans, who had initially advocated for Napoleon's son, found themselves able to support Louis-Philippe. What distinguished Louis-Philippe was his distinguished service in the Republican Army. The situation was of significant importance to the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Although he belonged to royalty, in many respects, he was considered one of their own. It was particularly noteworthy to these veterans that, despite being compelled to flee France, Louis-Philippe never resorted to arms against his homeland. While many exiled aristocrats chose that path, Louis-Philippe consistently declined to do so. This stance was highly regarded. Consequently, it appeared that Louis-Philippe was the sole candidate for the monarchy capable of uniting the liberal, conservative, and Republican factions, thereby averting a civil war. At least this was the situation as of the evening of July 30th, when Louis-Philippe was en route to Paris. Although not yet official, the reign of King Charles X was effectively at an end. Upon his arrival in Paris, Louis-Philippe was met with shouts of "Long live the Republic!" This posed a challenge, as the populace had been radicalized by the violence of the preceding 5 days. Indeed, it had only been 5 days, and there was a possibility that they would not support the continuation of the monarchy. Louis-Philippe faced the task of navigating a complex political landscape. He made a concerted effort to engage with the former generals of Napoleon and ensured that he appeared publicly alongside them, as well as with symbols of the revolution, such as the tricolor flag. Eastern Europe largely quelled its liberal uprisings, resulting in a conservative bloc where monarchies continued to exert significant influence over political affairs. The situation in France in 1830 serves as a cautionary tale regarding the consequences of conservative administrations attempting to stifle even minor advancements in liberal institutions. This predicament could have been averted if, at any point during the previous decade, France had permitted the liberals to secure an electoral victory. Elections function as essential release valves. Had the liberals in France gained governmental power and enacted some reforms, it would have alleviated enough pressure to prevent the July Revolution. However, the French ultra-conservatives of the 1820s undermined all potential release mechanisms to further their immediate political objectives. The demand for reform intensified to such an extent that the liberals were prepared to take drastic measures to attain it. Consequently, the monarchy was toppled, and the ultra-conservatives were permanently ousted from power in France. Their relentless opposition to any form of liberal reform ultimately led to their downfall. The same underlying factors that triggered the July Revolution in France were also present throughout Europe. While some governments were overthrown, others managed to endure. Yet every administration had to navigate the same turbulent conditions. Among these, Britain excelled in managing the crisis. The reason for this success lies in Britain's decision to resolve conflicts through political means, unlike many of its contemporaries. The election of 1830, which coincidentally occurred on the same day the French liberals seized Paris, initiated an unprecedented era of legislative activity in Britain, the likes of which had not been seen in a century. The British liberals achieved remarkable milestones, including the enactment of a measure previously deemed unattainable: the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire.